Greetings, Brookings Bio students. This is Mrs. Rydell, and today we're going to look at a little part of Chapter 4 and look a little bit closer at ways organisms interact in ecosystems. So we're going to kind of make a list, and then we'll go back and talk about each one of these. So some different ways that organisms interact. Number one is competition. And competition can be between organisms of the same species. For example, two squirrels fighting for nuts, or could be between different kinds of species, maybe different kinds of birds, but they're eating the same food in an ecosystem. And organisms compete with each other for resources that are available in the ecosystem to help them survive, and we're going to talk more about some of the ways that that happens. The second way is predation. Different kinds of organisms, usually animals don't hunt and kill others of their kind for food, but so usually between different kinds of organisms. But we have a hunter and we have somebody who's hunted, and somebody ends up lunch. And we talked about organisms eating other organisms for food, those heterotrophs, and it's one way to get the energy that you need to survive. We'll talk more about predation. And then the third way is something called cooperation, usually between the same kinds of organisms, maybe living in a family group or a small group of organisms that are similar to each other. Think a herd of bison or a flock of seagulls. And the last kind is something called symbiosis. And symbiosis is interaction, a close association with two kinds of organisms that are different from each other, but they work together and they interact in a way that's beneficial to one of those organisms in the partnership. So let's talk a little bit about resources, because we said resources, anything that that organisms are competing for resources to survive. And a resource is really anything that's needed by an organism to stay alive. Could be nutrients, that means food, water. If you're a plant, you're competing for light or to be able to grow and reach up to the sun. Space, territory is something that animals compete for. So resources are basically something that the organism is going to need for survival. And if you think about competition, some of the things organisms compete for, one of the big things is food, nutrients, getting the food that you need. Remember, heterotrophs have to consume other organisms, and sometimes that's not easy. Most organisms spend a big part of their day finding food. And so if you think about, there's competition, not enough food for everybody. Think about what's going to happen in this little picture with the lions and those scavenger birds waiting for the lion to finish his food. What do you think is going to happen when that lion walks away from the scraps, and all of a sudden the birds are going to converge on what's left, and there's going to be fighting, competition between them to see who's going to get food in that situation. Another thing that organisms compete for is shelter, place to make a home. Think about an organism that makes a den in a cave of some kind. There's only so many caves to go around in an ecosystem, and they're gonna compete with each other to have a place to build their home. If they're not defending that cave, someone else is gonna move in and take over. Think about owls, for example, that live in a hollowed out spot in a tree. There's only so many tree hollows to go around, and some birds are going to be left out in the cold. Competition for mates. Oftentimes in an ecosystem, the male of the species fights other males to have the chance to reproduce. And the reason deer have antlers, think moose, elk, the reason they have those antlers is the males are fighting each other for the females. This peacock in the picture is showing off his brightly colored tail to the female. He's saying, pick me, I'm better than those other males, I have a fancier, bigger tail, and is in getting the female to choose the male that's gonna reproduce. There's competition for space, for territory, and different kinds of organisms need different amounts of space. Prairie dogs are pretty social, and they live together in a colony. For an acre, for example, of territory, maybe you may have 5 to 35 prairie dogs living in that place. mountain lions are more solitary, and one male mountain lion needs between 50 and 300 square miles of space. They're going to patrol that space, they're going to mark that space as theirs, and that's their territory. And another lion comes into that space, there's going to be a fight. We often don't think of plants as fighters or competing for things, but plants have to compete for the things that they need too. They do have to be able to get the light that they need. Think about a little plant that starts growing in a forest like this. It's going to have a really tough time getting up high enough that it can receive sunlight. And there is competition between plants for space and for the light that they need to grow. Ways organisms interact. The second way that was on our list was predation. Different kinds of organisms. Somebody's the hunter and somebody's the lunch. And we talked about heterotrophs consuming other organisms, and in an ecosystem, a lot of time that means chasing the food down. If you think about this relationship between predators and prey, we're going to put some little labels on this here, vocab words. The hunter in this situation is called the predator. That's the one who's chasing down the bunny rabbit or the sheep or the whatever kind of animal. And the organism that is the lunch that gets eaten is the prey. Notice it's spelled P-R-E-Y, not P-R-A-Y. And those predator-prey relationships are pretty important. They're part of the food chains, the food webs in an ecosystem. And they're really part of maintaining the balance in an ecosystem. And that brings us to this idea of interdependence. When you depend on something, think about what it means to depend on something. Remember, we had the light-dependent reactions, and they needed light to make them happen in photosynthesis. And ecosystems are the same way. All of those living and non-living things in an ecosystem, they're interconnected to each other. They depend on each other, and what one does affects the other things in the system. You can't change even one thing without impacting the whole ecosystem. John Muir was a naturalist, and he's the founder of Sierra Club, which is an environmental group. And he said, when one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it's attached to the rest of the world. There's a saying that you can't pick a flower without jiggling a star, and everything is connected. When we start looking at ecosystems, there's very complex interactions between the organisms that live there. So if you think about this idea of competition, if resources are scarce, there's not enough food, there's not enough place to live, some of the organisms are not going to get what they need. And if you have organisms dying because they don't have food, they're going to starve to death. And that means the numbers in that population are going to decrease. They're going to have fewer of that animal in the ecosystem. And when resources are more plentiful, lots of food for everybody, everybody gets what they need, populations numbers are going to increase. And if you think about ecosystems, they kind of fluctuate. They don't stay the same numbers all the time. The population numbers go up and down. And when we're competing in nature and you have winners and losers, oftentimes the loser is gonna die. It's not going to survive if they don't get the things that they need. So if we look at that idea of not everybody gets what they need, there's a vocab word for that. If a nutrient is in short supply, there's not enough to go around for everybody. Or if it cycles very slowly, we're going to talk about cycles later on in the chapter, but nutrients cycle through the ecosystem, and the food chains pass those nutrients along, and at the end of the food chain or along the food chain, sometimes those nutrients get passed back into the ecosystem. As organisms die, the decomposers break them down and return their nutrients to the soil that can now be used by plants again to start a new food chain. So the idea of cycling nutrients, and if things are cycling slowly, we're using them up faster than they're being replaced by the cycles, there's a limit to the growth of a population. We call that a limiting factor. If there's not enough of something to go around, and usually this is food or water, it puts a limit on the size of the population. This little picture here is showing you what happened during a drought in Australia. And drought means no water. In this situation, it didn't rain for weeks at a time. And no water means no plants to eat. And there were a lot of organisms that died. They didn't have enough food. These are kangaroos that starved to death. And it puts a limit if there's not enough nutrients to go around. It puts a limit on the sizes of the population. If you think about this predator-prey relationship, it's not just I eat you and you're dead and you're gone. There's a complex interaction here, and remember we said everything is connected. So what the predators do impact the population of the prey, but prey also impacts the population of the predators. This was a little study that was done. There's a small island called Isle Royale. It's up near Canada, and basically there's not very many people that live on this small island, and it's a wild place, and the two main organisms that live there are wolves and moose. And wolves are predators, they eat the moose. But if you look at the population numbers, you can see a connection between those predators, the wolves, and the food that they eat, the prey, the moose. Because if you think about it, when predator numbers are high, they're going to eat a lot of moose, and the moose numbers are going to decrease. But once the numbers of the moose get low enough, now there's not enough food for the wolves to eat, and now some of those wolves are gonna starve, and the wolf population is going to go down. And when the wolf population goes down, there's fewer predators eating the moose, and the moose population is going to go up. If you look at this graph, you see that when the moose and the wolf numbers are going to kind of cycle, and they depend on each other. They kind of when the high moose wolves then have food, and the wolf numbers are going to increase, and then too many wolves, the moose numbers are going to go down, and they cycle together. They're connected to each other. If you don't remember anything else in this chapter, remember everything is connected, and changing one thing in an ecosystem can impact a whole lot of other organisms, even if there's not a direct feeding connection between the two. Okay, so let's connect this to something that we know. If you've ever been fishing or swimming in South Dakota in the summertime, about mid-August, most of our lakes start to look like this. And it has to do with that idea of limiting factors. I mean, remember he said if there's a limit to how much food is available, it kind of keeps the population in check. The numbers can't get very big because there's only so much food to go around. But if you supply an ecosystem with all the nutrients that they need, the population takes off. And if you think about lakes in South Dakota, most of our lakes are surrounded by farmland. There's cows there making poop, and there's fertilizer that's going on the fields. And where does that go when it rains? All of the fertilizer, the cow manure that's coming from our fields runs off and ends up in the ecosystem, in the water supply. And we may think of poop as gross, but what algae think of poop is food. That's nutrients. You're giving them unlimited food from fertilizer runoff, from animal waste, and it puts a huge amount of food. The population is no longer limited. The algae go crazy, and that's why our lakes turn green. We get what are called algal blooms, and it's because there is not a limit on the population. The nutrients are as much nutrient is available as they need, and the algae take off and basically take over the lake. The third way that organisms interact is called cooperation, and usually happens between organisms that are the same type, the same species. So maybe monkeys living together in a colony, or think a herd of elephants. In cooperation, you have organisms living together and helping each other, sharing food, child care responsibilities. If you've ever seen the little show Meerkat Manor on the Animal Planet, it's almost like a little family, a soap opera, and they have names, and you can watch what they do. It's a reality show, and think about organisms living together. If you're a sick organism and on your own, you have a very difficult time finding food. You might not survive, but you have a family member or someone who's helping you, taking care of you, or bringing you food, that's going to help those organisms survive by working together, taking care of each other. You see monkeys grooming, picking bugs, parasites off each other, sharing the child care. You have more to watch out for predators coming. If you think about even animals that hunt in packs, it's very difficult to bring down a big game animal by yourself, but if wolves hunt together in packs, they can do that. They can get more food and share the food. If you live in a herd, like this herd of zebra, you have protection. Not only are you watching for predators, but you have lots of friends watching too, and we can kind of watch in lots of different directions at the same time. Someone's got your back, and it's a way to help survival. The last kind of interaction we're going to talk about is symbiosis. Where did we kind of see that word before? If you remember back in our cell parts chapter, and we talked about the origin of mitochondria and chloroplasts, and we talked about Lynn Margulis and her endosymbiotic theory, endosymbiosis. Two different organisms, but interacting together in a way that's going to help each other. Remember we talked about bacterial ancestors becoming incorporated into a cell to eventually lead to those cell parts. Symbiosis has to do with different kinds of organisms, two different organisms living in close association together, and it's to the benefit of one of those partners. So three kinds of symbiosis. One is called mutualism, mutually beneficial, both organisms benefit. The second kind is called commensalism. One organism is benefiting from this relationship, and the other one, it doesn't really care. They're not hurting them, it's not helping them, they're just kind of there. And the third kind is parasitism. And notice in all of these, somebody's benefiting from the relationship, or they wouldn't do it. In parasitism, while one organism benefits, the other is harmed in some way. And let's talk about a couple examples of these three kinds of symbiosis. The first kind, mutualism, it's good for me and it's good for you. I'm doing something to help you, you're doing something to help me, and both organisms are benefiting from this relationship. If you've ever seen big animals, think giraffes, rhinoceros, elephants, oftentimes you see little birds riding around on their backs. And this is a mutually beneficial relationship. The birds are getting food from the big animals. They're picking bugs and parasites off. So that helps the giraffe. It helps the rhino by getting rid of those bugs. And think about that giraffe. If you have bugs walking on your back, you got a really hard time getting to those, itching them and getting them off. But allowing the birds to feed on you, pick those bugs off, is a help to the giraffe. And it's a help to the little bird too. He's getting protection. Nobody's going to mess with you if you're riding around on the back of a rhinoceros. And you're getting lunch out of the deal. So both of those organisms are benefiting by interacting with each other and having that relationship. Another example of mutualism is flowers and their pollinators. Insects pollinate plants, and they're helping the plant by spreading the pollen. They come to the plant to get food, to get nectar. So the plant is providing food for the insect, and the insect is helping the plant by spreading pollen as it goes from flower to flower and helping the plant reproduce. Remember, pollen, inside the pollen is the sperm, the male part of the male gametes, and they have to move to the next flower to reach the egg and fertilize and make a seed. So the insects, the pollinators, are helping the plant do sexual reproduction. And so both of those organisms are benefiting from that situation, that relationship. Another example of mutualism is what we saw in the Finding Nemo movie. Remember in the movie, if you watch that movie, the safe place to go back to the anemones. And clownfish get protection by hiding out in anemones. Anemones are poisonous. They have stinging cells that release poison, and other fish can't go in the anemones because they will be harmed by that. But clownfish have special protection. They make a slime, kind of a slime coating on their skin that protects them against the poison. And so they can swim in the anemones without being harmed. So it's a safe place to go and hide out because no one's going to go in after you and try and hurt you. Anemones, what do they get out of the deal? Anemones, when you look at them, they look like plants, but they're not. Anemones are a kind of animal, and if you're an animal that's anchored to one place and you can't hunt for food or chase after food, you need a way to have food come to you. And so as the clownfish are hanging out in the anemones eating their lunch, little bits of particles of food drop down on the anemones, and anemones can get that food and use it to survive. So the fish are helping the anemones, and the anemones are helping the fish, and both of them are getting something out of that relationship. The second kind of symbiosis we talked about is commensalism, and good for me. So I'm getting something out of the deal, and you don't really care. It doesn't hurt you, doesn't help you. If you've ever seen sharks swimming, you notice that there's lots of little fish that kind of follow along next to the shark, behind the shark. For example, these are pilot fish, and they are waiting for the shark to catch something to eat and rip up the food and put scraps into the water, and then the little pilot fish will pick those up. So the fish are getting the benefit of the shark hunting for them and finding food and tearing it up and making it available to them. Does the shark care if those fish follow it? No, doesn't really help the shark, doesn't hurt the shark in any way. The shark is kind of there, but he doesn't really he doesn't care what's going on. And so it's helping the pilot fish, but doesn't really hurt or help the shark. That would be an example of commensalism. Another example is hermit crabs. Hermit crabs make homes out of abandoned shells that they find that have been left behind by snails that have died. And so they find the shell on the in the bottom of the ocean somewhere and crawl into it, and they have a little house. They have protection. And so the snail is benefiting the crab by leaving their shells behind, but the snail doesn't really get a benefit from the crab. The snail isn't harmed by the crab. The crab's not fighting the snail and taking its shell. It's just picking up those abandoned shells. So the snail is benefiting the crab, but crab doesn't help the snail, doesn't harm the snail. The snail is really out of the picture. That would be an example of commensalism. The third kind of symbiosis is parasitism. And if you look at whales or other big ocean animals, often you see almost looks like warts or bumps growing on the surface of the skin. Those are not warts. They are barnacles. They're critters. They're little crustaceans that attach to their skin of the whale, and they're feeding on the skin and the bodily fluids of the whale. Think about like ticks that feed on dogs or on you. And the same thing is happening here. Those barnacles are attached to the whale, and they're taking nutrients from the whale. It's harming the whale, helping the barnacle. This would be these are parasites attacking and taking advantage of the whale for food. Same as a tick on a dog or on you. In South Dakota, if you go out in the hiking around in the high grass in the springtime, you got to do a tick check. And ticks are parasites. They get onto an animal and they suck your blood. And benefits the tick, they're getting lunch out of the deal. But if you think about the host animal, the host has some disadvantages. It hurts, can get infections from tick bites. Ticks can carry diseases like Lyme disease. And so if you think about the relationship, the tick is benefiting, but the host is being harmed. Another example of a parasite that infects humans is tapeworms. And tapeworms get into your body from eating something. And once those eggs hatch, grow into a full-size worm in your intestines, tapeworms have a little head with hooks and suckers on it that they grab and hold on inside, and basically they hang out inside your intestines and wait for you to digest the food, and they absorb the food going past. So tapeworm gets an advantage, lunch. You're the lunch, or I should say the food you're breaking down is the lunch, And the tapeworm is benefiting, but the host animal can be harmed. Tapeworms can grow up to 30 feet long. They can clog things up. They can make you sick. They're taking the food and nutrients that you would be absorbing, and it's going to the worm. If you think about giving your dog heartworm pills, we do that in South Dakota, and it's protecting your dog against another kind of parasitic worm that lives in blood vessels. And your dog gets bit by a mosquito that has the carrying the parasite and gets into their bloodstream and can clog up their arteries, can clog up their heart, and they can die from that. And parasitic infections can harm the host animal. That takes care of this part of our slideshow. We're going to talk more about cycling and nutrient cycling in ecosystems in our next slideshow.